don't be afraid of a Scandi line. And what most people don't get about Scandi heads is that they're probably the easiest line to cast. Okay, to be ultra clear, we're talking a full floating Scandi shooting head with a mono-leader level or tapered up to 15, 17 feet or rod length minimum. My buddy wants a Scandi head for his Redington Dually 6126-4. It's a 6-weight, 12'6". So Paul, the manager at Fin and Fire Fly Shop, sets him up with a 390 grain Rio Scandi short. So my buddy wants me to test it and see if it's the right line. So absolutely. So I cast this thing, and it is the most phenomenal setup. I can't believe for the price point of that rod, and for, you know, everybody wants the old Airflo Compact, which those are super cool shooting heads, but the Airflo Compact Scandi. But the Rio Scandi head, I don't know if I'm not talking Rio Scandi short body, the Rio Scandi head in the short version, 31-foot version, is a super sweet fly line. Super sweet Scandi head, okay? Most of us start out with Skagits, and we like a Skagit head because it's nice and heavy, it loads our rod, it's easy to cast. But really, the thing about them, you need a tip, you need a sink tip on them, right? And we like heavy flies because getting down gives us confidence. But to learn to Spey cast, I think that the Scandi is the easiest, because, you know, there's so much talk about, oh, they got this taper and they're long. I'm not opposed at all to just taking that rear taper on these Scandi lines and just chopping it off, you know. Scandi heads really, if it's a 31-foot head, it is designed for basically really long leaders and casting from the bank, okay? So in America, we kind of don't get it, you know, but in the Scandinavian country, you know, they're literally casting from the bank. That's the reason for the short shooting head. They don't have any back cast room, so I'm told, or not much, so you can't have much of a D-loop. So 31-foot head, 17-foot leader, 25, whatever. The idea is just to give it a little flip back and cast it like that. So Scandi lines are super easy to manage. So get a Scandi line, don't be afraid. They're just butter. If you get a good setup. I had another question from a guy. He's got a older gentleman, you know, bad shoulders. He's got a 8-weight, 13-foot Echo full Spey rod. And I looked it up on the Real Line recommendations, and they recommend basically the middle of the road would be 550 Scandi. So what my recommendation would be, since we weighed, you know, so a 31-foot Scandi head wading up to your belly, you know, that turns into a pretty long line for me. You know, if you're really tall or have a really long rod, that's one thing. But for me, like, if I have a 33-foot Scandi head, I chop it back to, you know, under 30 feet. Maybe anywhere from 27, 28, something like that. I want them short because I just want to go whoop, whoop. Okay, I don't, if I'm wading over rocks and hiking all day and wading and all that stuff, I do not want to have a long line where I'm going like that if I'm not on the perfect beach for it, where I have a ton of room, ton of back cast room. I'm usually like wading deep, not casting super far, you know, 8 or 10, 12 strips. So I got 2 loops of running line in my hands, mono running line, 30 or 40-pound test, Berkeley big game. That's what I use, okay? Doesn't matter what line, what shooting head I have, that's what I use. this running line, it does coil a little bit, but if you soak it all night, what mono does is it gets filled up. The insides of mono line gets filled up with water. It gets saturated with water. It softens up. It makes for nice loops, but it sinks because of that, okay? So, but that's okay, because 2 loops of, say, 5 or 6 strips each, coiled in 1 finger, they just, flies just fine. Doesn't matter if it sinks or not. If we're talking a little bit heavier grains, steelhead size heads. So you get your mono running line. I've got my shooting head, and with a Scandi line, I don't use Polyleaders. I use a long mono leader, rod length, or maybe a little longer, rod length and a half, whatever floats your boat. So the idea is I tire myself out just fishing, just wading, just stumbling through rocks, leaning on my wading staff, trying not to fall down, but falling down, hiking down the river, hiking up to the car. It's a butt kicking for an older guy, and as we're getting older, we want to conserve energy. So that's why if you have a 30-foot Scandi head and a 13 to 15-foot rod, and you just have to go like that, you're golden. That's all I want to do in certain areas. If it's a long belly area where I can get away with it, then I love casting the long lines, but usually I'm backed up against the brush. I got trees overhead, I'm having to throw sidearm and having to do all these weird things, and I want a super short shooting head. So with a Scandi line, I just want you can use level mono for your leader. You can use like 15 foot of a 12-pound test, or in my case, sometimes I use heavier. So, or you can go, 15 foot, put a little teeny perfection loop in there, and then put on a tippet a few feet, whatever. But the idea is, I don't like polyleader. When you put a polyleader, a weighted polyleader on the end of a Scandi line, you're gonna go from a little deal like this to more of a Spey cast. Instead of an underhand cast, you're gonna go to more of a Spey cast. Just a little more, depending on your height, weight, limb length, all that stuff. Don't be afraid of a Scandi line. Get a short, compact one, unless you're like really tall, and go for it. Now, Rage lines, I'm not a big fan. Some people love them, some people hate them. The recommended Rage deal is you go a little bit under the Skagit weight. But if you want a really super duper bullet, dart, laser throwing setup, try underlining that Rage head. So if you got say your rod calls for 500 Skagit. So for Rage, you'd go 30, instead of throwing a 510 Skagit, you do a 480 Rage. But my suggestion would be go down to about a 400 Rage, because they got such a big ass end on them. When you punch them, that back end of the Rage is so heavy that it'll load your rod, and you can shoot BBs out there that are just like just darts. It will throw super crazy darts, super high line speed. But if I want to go for a super duper dart throwing, super fun line, under grain at about 100 grains or more or less, but that's the idea. If you're like the guy with the full Spey, he's got a 600 Rage on there, okay? So that's gonna be basically a Skagit setup. Figure it like a Skagit line. So my recommendation for you, buddy, would be, I would go with a 550 grain. If you're like 6'7", you might get the longer Rio Scandi head. But if you get the shortest Rio Scandi head at 550 grains for that rod, then you can do your 15 to 17 feet of fluorocarbon. That'll get down if you use a sparse fly and it's got a little teeny bit of weight to it, you know, whether it's, you know, sparse fly, little bit of weight, but not enough to you know, make it really difficult to cast. It will get down. Lots of guys fish that way. So my recommendation is just that. Long leader, sparse fly that will get down. You know, 31-foot Rio Scandi shooting head, long mono leader, and you will be golden. And so I would recommend you guys go to the Rio Spey recommendation charts, pick a Scandi line for your rod that's right in the middle there. So if it says the lightest is 520 and the heaviest is 580, go with 550. So I just strongly suggest get a Scandi line. They are so much fun, and you know, it's like, it's as easy as a Skagit head. Don't be intimidated at all. They're very easy to cast. I've had guys that were just learning to Spey cast. You give them a good setup, and a, you know, properly lined Scandi line on a decent rod, and it's just as easy for beginners. So don't be intimidated. So that way you keep your cast in here. You can still do all your waterborne casts, your touch and go cast. Anyway, do get a Scandi line. Another thing is the scientific anglers, Spey Lite Scandi, their 440 grain is only 25 feet long. I'm probably gonna get one of those just because I like them really short. I don't want to do a Spey cast. I want to go like that. And the beauty of using mono running line, you know, a lot of guys like the plastic running line, which I don't care for, or the integrated. That's not my favorite for most situations, but I do like it for some. The beauty is, if I'm gonna cast it, so let's say I can lift, cast, there's my cast, and then there's my mend. So when the line's shooting out with the mono running line, it's always gonna hit the end. I'm usually gonna catch it before it lands. I'm gonna cast and mend like that. So cast, I'm not gonna do that kind of mend a lot of the time. If I can get away with it, I'll just go before it lands. As it's shooting out, it hits the end. If I can go and then it hits the end of, you know, my rod, it rolls out and lands, and then it's set up in a proper alignment with the current for the swing. So that's why super short head, mono running line, if you wading up to your armpits or back against the brush like I am on the shoots, it's a perfect setup for me, and it's easy to cast, and you can get down with a little weight on there and a long leader. So give it a shot.